Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Geekfest Rants. This is our 15th episode, and today joining me is Steve Ravona. Say hi, Steve.
Hey, Carlos.
Today's topic is a little different than usual. We're going to talk about collecting, spurios like toys, autographs, ornaments, collectibles, books, magazines, all that sort of thing that we might have done, we probably have done for years, and how it's evolved since the beginning. Steve, why don't you tell me a little bit about what are the earliest things you can remember collecting and about how old you were when you started doing it?
Well, I think the three things that I started collecting as a child, and I won't go into detail on one of them because it's not a mutual interest. One was baseball cards. The other is Star Wars action figures and toys and play sets. And the other is comic books. And it's basically how I learned to read. And I suppose if I'm thinking back, I saw superheroes on cartoons on Saturday morning, and I was attracted to that. And then when I was very young, my parents started giving me an allowance, and I would take the allowance, and every week I'd go to the stationery store with my father, and I'd pick up a couple of comics. And this is probably around 1974, 75 when I could get them for a quarter.
Wow.
So I could get two comics. I'd get 50 cent allowance, and I'd buy two comics. And that's how it started, and it just went crazy from there. The other, again, is Star Wars figures, and that's something we share, and a lot of our friends share. Wars came out in 1977, and immediately there was this hunger for some sort of toy, whatever, play sets. And I remember, and I don't know, Carlos, if you were in the States, you probably weren't at the time, because Kenner, they couldn't publish the action figures quick enough, so they offered this
The Sears wait and get kind of box
yes,
thing.
Yeah, you get a cardboard
Pre-order.
box and pre-order, right? And then I guess I don't know. I remember maybe it had like a stand that you could put the figures on when you got the figures, but I had that. And when the first movie came out, I just went nuts. That dominated every Christmas, every birthday. I was probably more into the figures, and I got the play sets. I got the X-wing, the Millennium Falcon, the Cantina, Death Star, Star Destroyer, Patrol Dewback, you name it. I mean, I was crazy into that, and also too, I mentioned before I used to collect baseball cards, but another thing I used to collect was Star Wars cards.
Yep.
They came out. Topps put out Star Wars cards, and I bought those like a crazy man.
Now, your figure collection, did it continue through all three movies?
It did. As a matter of fact, even when Jedi came out, I started to wonder maybe I was a little too old for this, but it won out. Especially since Jedi had so many cool creatures that I was immediately. I was probably on the wane. I wasn't as into it as I was when I was a kid, because different hobbies dominated it at different. The comic hobby over, and money was an issue. So it was, where did you want to put your money? And, if a Star Wars movie hadn't come out in 2 years, there was no internet. There was nothing to keep the interest level there except, maybe Star Wars comics or magazines or something like that. But
how about that other little thing you're into called Star Trek? Was there any of that going on back then?
Well, at the time in the late 70s, I'm not like an original Star Trek fan a lot of our friends started watching the show in syndication in the late 70s.
Yeah, I don't think our group actually got to watch it live.
Yeah, no, none of our group did. But my father was very big into Star Trek, and he tried to get me into it when the reruns were on, WPIX Channel 11. And I had no interest. I guess that every time he put it on, I just thought it looked cheesy, and it wasn't grabbing me the way Star Wars was grabbing me. And so but I should say that I did have the Star Trek dolls, the Mego dolls that were released in the mid to late 70s, in the Enterprise playset. That's another. Predating the Star Wars action figures, my parents bought for me the Mego superhero action figures, the Planet of the Apes action figures, the Star Trek action figures. So I had all that stuff. I mean, so that actually comes before Star Wars, and we're talking like 74, 75,
Any
76.
Any GI Joes or $6 Million Man?
I did have $6 Million Man. That was probably my earliest sci-fi favorite, and I had him. I had Maskatron. I had the Bigfoot. I had the whatever it was. I don't. I can see it in my mind, but I don't have any of this stuff anymore. But
Now, with the Star Wars, were you able to? You said you kept up with all three films. Did you get a full collection of all the figures? Did you go all the way to the end?
Through Jedi.
Really?
I
Wow.
probably had everybody through Jedi, and I would say probably 75 to 80% of the ships and playsets. I was not a big collector of the large size action figures. I had a handful though. I had Boba Fett, I had Darth Vader, IG-88, who was kind of a rare large size figure, and I think I might have had Chewbacca. But other than that, I didn't go for the large size figures because there wasn't anything you could do with them. There were no play sets for them, no ships. They looked cool. Boba Fett was amazing, but yeah, I went. I had Jabba the Hutt. I had all that stuff. But after Jedi, then whatever they came out with in like the mid '80s on, I didn't get until the '90s, the mid '90s. I think it was Power of the
Force is when they
something.
rebooted everything.
Yes, and they had like the muscular figures.
He-Man, Luke.
Yeah, exactly. They were all jacked up, and I did get a bunch of those. But yeah, so but for the original trilogy, I was all over.
Now,
that.
what happened to those original toys?
Well, in probably when I was a teenager, maybe like 16, 17. See, one hobby would always probably fall by the wayside to feed another. Once the Star Wars films stopped, I interest in Star Wars, but the interest level wasn't as high. And I couldn't see the future. I was not thinking ahead. I was not somebody who saved the boxes, first of all. I mean, I played with my stuff. I played with my figures, and I played hard. I threw out all the boxes. So I had nothing, there was nothing that even approximated mint condition. It was all loose. And what I started to do was I started selling off the ships and the play sets so I could buy comics, because I had a comic book shop had just opened in my hometown, and they had back issues and they had everything, and I was just such a voracious comic reader and I couldn't, I didn't have, I had an allowance, I didn't have a job, so to generate money, I met somebody, at the comic shop, and I told him what I had, and he would come to my house and we would agree on prices. I mean, I probably got completely rolled. I mean, I was 16 years old, 17 maybe at the most, and I sold a lot of stuff. And I kept the action figures for a very long time until just very recently, probably within the last year or so, I did another, it was just another one of those things where, my collection, I just sold the rest of that.
Wow.
So my loose action figures got sold, and right now I don't have anything. But I mean, we can get to that in a sec. We could as we go farther on, in terms of.
Any other main old collectible that you were into, or those are the big ones?
I think those are the big ones: the comics, the Star Wars, and the superhero action figures, the Star Wars cards, and baseball cards. Yeah, that was
for me. I had similar Star Wars interests, obviously, but it didn't. Anything that I collected probably didn't start until Star Wars, I imagine. First of all, when I saw Star Wars, I wasn't here. I was somewhere else. I was back in Uruguay. And I remember I visited my grandparents here once, just with my mom. We came to visit, as tourists. And while here, and this must have been maybe 78, while here, I picked up maybe 5 or 6 of the basic figures, the basic Star Wars figures. And I brought them back with me. And I remember back in Uruguay for a period of about a year, all my friends would see these 5 figures and they were like, wow, these are amazing, because nobody ever seen anything of that good quality as far as toys go, as far as action figures go, really.
Right.
And,
right.
Those...
Was the movie released in Uruguay at the same time?
Yeah, it was released maybe a couple of months later, but I definitely saw it in Uruguay. I remember that. I couldn't tell you if it was dubbed or dubbed or subtitled. I think back then, or at least still at some point, they still dub everything because it's not like a foreign film that people want to see it in the original language. This was a mass released vehicle that had to be seen by as many people as possible, so it was probably dubbed. But I did remember, and it caused enough of an impact for me that when I came here, it's like, hey, how about all that Star Wars stuff that I remember I saw once? And that's when I started picking up some of these toys. Then a year later in '79, when we came here for good, that's when I started really picking up more and more and more and more stuff. I kept up with all the basic figures throughout the films, except the last wave of Jedi. This is the wave that I believe it used to come with a coin. The figures came with a coin. That's the wave I couldn't find. It was, the line was dying, and it was harder and harder to find these last wave figures.
Yeah, no, I didn't get those either. I should correct myself. I didn't get those either.
Those were hard to find, and I kept up with some at the time with some of the vehicles and play sets, especially more of the Empire and Return of the Jedi line, because by the time I got back here, it was 1980, so that's the beginning of Empire. But unfortunately, a lot of those toys, like I kept all the figures that I had, and those figures traveled with me everywhere we moved. Up until now, they're still in this house now. But I gave them all to Kyle to play with, and I didn't care. I was like, out of all my collection, it all came down to a plastic bag full of action figures. All the play sets, all the ships, all that other stuff, I kind of left it behind, which is one of my biggest regrets. When we used to live in Jackson Heights, in an apartment building, I remember when we moved out, in the basement storage area, we left a lot of stuff we didn't want, and included in that pile of stuff that we left behind was a large plastic football that was a storage cabinet type of deal. And in there were all my play sets and ships. And up until this day, I still regret all that stuff I left in that. It wasn't like a complete collection of anything, but it's still, I would have loved to given Kyle all that stuff just so he can beat it to crap like the figures. I don't care, but it was... It's one of those regrettable things. But back then, that was my main thing. I didn't have a large collection of anything else, really. And those were the type of toys that kept me going. I did collect the Topps cards, just like you. Again, they ended up in that damn cabinet that they're somewhere. I just hope that they didn't end up in a landfill somewhere. I hope somebody actually gave them to somebody and someone's enjoying them, or they're probably on eBay as we speak. But like I said, that was mainly it for me as far as the old stuff goes. I wasn't into comics. I never got into it. And anything else that I might have had, I also got rid of in some shape or form. And then we had that lull, that mid '80s to early '90s period where Star Wars took a nap, and then it all started up again, which kind of leads us probably to where we are right now.
Phase 2,
right? Where we are right now. We're no longer using our parents' money. I hope we're not using our parents' money. But most of the stuff we have right now is as a result of whatever we're buying for ourselves. And what do you think from what you have right now? Is part of this phase 2 of collecting that you have?
Well, I guess I stuck with in a sense. I never lost comics in terms of I still read them, but I got to a point definitely in the '90s when we were in college, and after college, before I got married. I was probably, now this is where you can get into the discussion of whether or not this is an illness or some sort of a syndrome. But with comics, I mean, it was definitely something I treasured. I read them and reread them, and I loved getting them. But there became this need to have complete sets and to get all these special covers.
But at what point did you go from being just a reader to a collector?
I probably became a collector in high school and college. I mean, this is one of my ornaments just went off.
That happened to me like an hour ago, and I have no reason why. The lights didn't go off, and one of them just started talking. Just for the sake of argument, which one was it? Because mine was a Star Trek one.
Mine was Darth Vader talking to the Emperor. It's one of the new ones from this year.
Maybe they kind of know we're talking about collectibles, and they're trying to tell us something.
I don't know, because we're going to get to that, the ornaments. That'll probably be the last one. But with the comics, it really it became all consuming, and I have to admit that I was spending money that I didn't have. I mean, I wasn't spending my parents' money, but my parents were very good to me. They paid for college, and I didn't want for anything. And instead of saving money, I was blowing it on comics. I mean, this is right before the internet, but I was doing mail order to get my comics, and I was probably spending upwards of 150 to 200 bucks a month while we were in college.
Wow.
And I was working at the TV center, and we were working at the library, and it was bad. And I was falling for every gimmick that was like I said, every special cover and every different whatever. And that's where I definitely became a collector. I became cognizant of the value of what I had. At a certain point, I was keeping them in bags and putting the boards in them, the acid-free boards, and making sure everything was perfect, and getting the boxes.
Now, at any point, are you starting to think to yourself, because we're going to have to talk about this sooner or later, is this an investment, or is this for me to enjoy, or how far do you treat these things with kids clubs?
Well, I was thinking both. I was enjoying them, but when I was a kid, I could read them 10, 20 times if I had no time to do it. What else did I have to do? But I was getting older. I had a social life. I was going out. I was doing things. I was, getting a job, and I could read them, maybe put them away, seal them up, and hope that they increased in value. And I, as opposed to the Star Wars figures, which I knew had no value because they were not in the box, they had been played with and whatever. And the same with the cards. They were all, with the bent corners and everything. There was no value to those. But I started to, I probably at my height, I had anywhere between 10 and 15,000 comics. But I thought, but
how many comic book boxes is that the equivalent of?
I don't know. I mean, I had these upright shelves, and there were like 4 boxes on a shelf, and there were 4 shelves per upright. I had long boxes and I had small boxes. I mean, it got so out of hand. And then when I got married, I had to leave them at my parents' house for years until I had the space. And then it was such a project to finally bring a house. I had to, one at a time or 2 at a time because they were so
Sneak
heavy.
them in.
Yeah, and it got to be ridiculous. And at the same time, some other stuff came down the pike. Laserdiscs, DVDs, collecting movies. I had always been into movies, and VHS was never really something an affordable. Once in a while you'd get a movie would come out and it would be $14.95 or $19.95, but you really couldn't. They were always priced for rental. But then Laserdiscs came out, and again, talk about spending money you don't have. We were in college. I was buying those. Once I saw my first Laserdisc, I was immediately sucked in. I think my first one was Blade Runner, Criterion Blade Runner, and I was like, and it was letterboxed and it had the special features and everything, and I was like, I'm up for that. I mean, I guess you could say logical here. I have somewhat of an addictive personality. It's like something I like comes my way, and I'm attracted to. I'm like, I have to get it all.
Yeah. There is a common denominator here that I see, not just in yourself, but in myself and some other people I know. It just seems to mutate in different directions and in different intensities. For everybody. Now, for me, the college years were kind of like, I remember Star Wars did start up again, but I didn't go as crazy as I did originally because I first of all wasn't too crazy about the look of them. As you mentioned before, for some reason the sculpting, these things look like little He-Man figures. They purposely made them that way because they were trying to market them in a different way to kids who want big, muscular, weightlifter type bodies. And over the years, they slowly started correcting that, but it took forever. But at the time, I was also going a little nuts with Star Trek figures. Star Trek Next Generation, I believe I think it was Playmates, the company that put them out. And it's funny because back then, I had the beginnings of a rule of how I was going to do it, but it completely failed. The rule was, let me just get the main characters, or let me just get the alien-looking characters. And I did. Okay. And then Wave 2 came, Wave 3, Wave 5, Wave 10. I don't know how many waves they went. They went through all shows. They went through Next Gen, DS9, Voyager, and Enterprise. And they just kept going and going, and I kept up with them, and I kept up with them. And it got to the point where I remember, it starts to kind of like, when you hear about a new wave coming, you're like, oh no, not another new wave. And then they do the same trick they do with Star Wars. They, the repaints, and this one is a little different than that one. And it starts to get ridiculous to the point where I remember I was even customizing some because some were so either expensive, so rare, and so hard to find that there was no way in hell I could get certain figures. So I would make them myself. I would buy parts. I would buy other figures and take them apart and reassemble them and repaint them. And I was able to do that for like one or two of them. But I think that was the last time I went completely berserk on a collection like that with Star Trek. And luckily it didn't carry on to Star Wars. Star Wars, because I knew that Star Wars was so huge. You got to also keep in mind when Next Gen came out, you never know how crazy they're going to get with a collection. I love it when something comes out and it's small and short and very limited because then you don't have to go crazy. But Star Trek did go crazy. Star Wars, on the other hand, I already knew how crazy that could get. So I didn't get sucked into I got to get them all because it was just nuts. So for Star Wars, I just kind of got a couple here or there. Probably nothing that you would find in my house now anymore. But I did also, I remember, did keep up with like yourself first with the lasers, which you introduced me to, and that's a whole other show. the progression of of laser discs and leading to DVDs
media
and DivX.
Well, you can start with VHS and go to everything. Yeah. Sure.
I mean, I wasn't too crazy in terms of VHS, in terms of collecting too many movies. But the Laserdisc when the Laserdisc craze started, it did grab me a bit, and unfortunately, it was an expensive investment because those things were expensive back then. And then the switch over to that's what happened when we switched over to DVD. Instead of re-getting everything all over again, I just picked and chose. Which is a similar thing I'm going through now with Blu-ray. I'm not going to redo the whole thing again. No, I'll get a couple of key titles and then the rest copy them or I can live without.
Right, exactly.
Now, while this is happening, not as crazy because luckily they don't have too much out, but Star Wars books, making of books, art of Star Wars, art of this, art of that, I've always bought those books as they came. And like I said before, luckily because they didn't used to put too many of them out, I was able to keep up with them without going nuts. And that continued, again, through college up to now. Well, that wraps up part 1 on our special on collecting. Please join us again next time when we will continue delving into the topic of collecting and we will talk about exactly what are our current collections. On behalf of Steve Avona and myself, thank you for joining us. See you next time on Geekfest Rants.